More than 90 questions were asked of the House impeachment managers over 10 hours yesterday, and even more queries from the senators are expected today.
Joining us now via Skype to weigh in on all the latest on impeachment and also the Middle East peace deal, or plan at least, is David Pakman, host of the David Pakman Show, friend of our show. Great to see you, David.
Thank you.
All right, so catch us up on impeachment. What did you see as the most significant developments yesterday?
Well, the most significant development was that about 80% of the questions were essentially almost like dramatic planned plays, in the sense that the questions were known in advance. They had video clips just happened to be queued up to answer that exact question. I mean, I don't really think we learned effectively anything other than the status quo of a foregone conclusion of an acquittal after some kind of debate Friday about whether or not a trial should have witnesses is still the trajectory. The only real question mark for me at this point is how many, if any, Republicans are going to say, yes, John Bolton should testify, yes, maybe Mick Mulvaney should testify, and then how soon and how will they justify ultimately voting to acquit Donald Trump? Those are really the only questions that are remaining for me.
Yeah, I mean, David, I think, let's be honest, I don't think that John Bolton is going to testify. And actually, I believe we saw, which senator was it? I think Ted Cruz, who said there is no chance that John Bolton will come before the U.S. Senate if Hunter Biden does not. And because Biden has basically made it clear that that is totally off the table to the Democratic senators, I mean, we could see a vote on Friday for acquittal. I think it's very, very likely that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and what's incredible about that is, without getting too far into the weeds, the question about witnesses should be, is it a material witness to the matter that is being discussed by the Senate? And while the Republicans have made every effort to make this about Joe and Hunter Biden, and there's no question, as I've said before, that Joe and Hunter Biden, like many political families and like many political insiders, represent real problems with this sort of corrosive revolving door of influence peddling. It is not material to whether or not Donald Trump did the things he is accused of doing in the impeachment articles. And it's actually a form of evil genius, I would say, by Republicans. I congratulate them in terms of how they're playing the game. At the beginning, they said, hey, let's have 64 hours of stuff before we talk about witnesses. And then they are already preparing to say, we've done so much already. I don't know that we really need more stuff. Where in any other case, you would first talk about who will be coming before us to testify and build your case knowing that.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think it's a hard case for Democrats to make that that Hunter certainly and Joe honestly aren't material fact witnesses, given that the Trump defense is that this was justified because there was potential corruption here and we needed to get to the bottom of it. So personally, I think that's a hard case for Democrats to make. But I also wanted to get your thoughts, David, on how this is interfering with the Democratic primary process. I mean, I was on CNN's New Day yesterday. I think our segment was basically the only one where they were actually talking about the Iowa primary that is on our doorstep. So there's another process unfolding that is much more likely to actually remove Donald Trump for office. And there's very, very little attention being paid to it in most of the media.
Yeah. So first of all, 110%. I think I've been saying since April of 2017, and there's video, fact check me on it, that there's one process that is going to remove Donald Trump, and it's November of 2020 voting. 25th Amendment stuff because of cognitive decline. Believe it or not, it's not going to work. The Mueller report was never going to remove Trump. Impeachment was never going to remove Trump. The process is the one that will happen in November of 2020. Now, that being said, the expectation that pulling Bernie and Warren off of the campaign trail into the Senate for the trial and the attention being taken away from the primary, it has actually not hurt the progressive movement in the primary. I've been seeing that you've been following the Bernie surge in the polls. It's happening nationally. It's happening in Iowa. It's happening in New Hampshire. Not so much Nevada and South Carolina, but yes, in California and Texas. So I don't actually think it's hurting the progressive movement.
Yeah, I think it might have been able to, but just because the country doesn't seem to care as much about the story, that seems to be what it is. David, at the same time, you've been following the Middle East peace plan, and full confession from both of us, we've been so wrapped up in the election and all this, so we haven't been able to get as much of the facts on that. Could you break it down for the viewers? The Trump administration, in normal times, this would be massive news. I think it's barely a blip on the radar. So what is being proposed? What are the potential impacts here?
Well, the facts are sort of part two. Part one is you have an impeached president and an indicted Israeli prime minister deciding that they've come up with a peace plan that they've dubbed the deal of the century. So you have to understand the absurdity of that before you even get into the specifics. Now, the specifics are very typical of what you would expect from Donald Trump, which is there's no new ideas added other than mentions of resorts and hotels that this party or that party is going to be able to build or have access to. The deal is very similar, in fact, to a lot of what was in the Oslo Accords to begin with. But there's just not going to be any traction on this, given the circumstances, given that it's just so clearly a political stunt by Donald Trump and by Benjamin Netanyahu, both who have incentives to take attention away from what they're dealing with within their countries. Now, it sort of exceeds the scope of what we can talk about here, but I put together what I believe is a realistic compromise. And by that, I mean one that people on both sides probably won't be happy with, as any good compromise leads to. And there happen to be, by chance, some items in the Middle East peace plan that are likely to be part of an eventual credible plan. For example, a contiguous Palestinian state where Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank are physically linked in a way that doesn't require going through Israeli-controlled security checkpoints. But that's a detail. The big picture of this is that it's laughable for an impeached president and an indicted prime minister, in the absence of any Palestinian leadership, saying, we figured it out, here's the deal of the century.
Right. Well, that's the piece is, I mean, what has the Palestinian response been, and how can you even imagine that you'd be able to make some kind of a deal when they haven't been brought into the process?
Yeah, so the Palestinian Authority opted out of participating in the process because the deal includes some land swaps, which Arafat in the 90s said he was conceivably open to if they were meaningful land swaps. But these are details that maybe are deeper than we would go in our initial analysis of it. But it's also important to understand that the similarities between what Trump and Netanyahu proposed to the Oslo Accords, a lot of those Oslo Accords were at least potentially appealing to Palestinian leadership. So it's much more complicated than sort of any one analysis could make, in terms of, well, there was no Palestinian involvement. At the same time, they chose not to be involved, but they chose not to be involved for very predictable reasons on the basis of what's in the agreement. Right. The big picture for me is Jared Kushner was never going to solve the problem of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Stunned.
Donald Trump is not going to be the one who solves it, particularly, again, impeached Trump and indicted Netanyahu are not where Palestinian-Israeli peace is going to come from.
I have been skeptical. I mean, Netanyahu, for the last decade, has made it pretty clear that he's not particularly interested in peace, and that's actually hardened the Palestinians to a pace where they're not particularly interested in a deal. I don't really see any political dynamics changing in all three countries for the next decade in order to accomplish what you're talking about, David. So I guess on that optimistic note, thank you for your analysis.
Yeah, and people should go check out. You've got videos on your channel with more specifics about your own ideas here. People should go and check that out.
I'm really interested to see more of that.
Yeah,
thank you.
We'll go educate ourselves. Thank you, David.
Thanks, guys.
Next on Rising, what exactly is Medicare Prices for All? Washington Monthly senior editor Philip Longlin, he's going to explain next.